Ms Kerry.
My lady, good morning. The first witness this morning is Miss Sarah Moore.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare.
And affirm that the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Ms Moore, your full name, please.
My name is Sarah Esther Moore.
Thank you very much for the statement you provided to the inquiry, which will be published later today, dated the 21st of October 2024. And you're going to help us, I hope, with some issues relating to the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, or VDPS for short. Can I start with your background, though, please? Ms Moore, I think, is this right, that you qualified as a solicitor in 2006?
That's right.
You are now a partner at Lead A, and for much of your career, you've been involved in group claims for people who've suffered injury or other forms of loss.
That's correct.
And I think in terms of relevance for this inquiry, you act for approximately 50 individuals bringing a claim against AstraZeneca in respect of serious injuries or death, which they submit was caused by the AZ vaccine.
That's correct.
And no doubt through that work with them and indeed other work that you've conducted, you have knowledge and understanding of the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme.
Yes.
All right. Can I ask you about the scheme generally to start? We know that it was set up, I think, in 1979. Ms Moore, if it helps you, I'm at paragraph 16 onwards in your statement, where you say there were three key features of the scheme. Firstly, to improve public confidence in vaccination. Secondly, to recognise the special case that the vaccine injured constituted a group who had been injured and therefore, as a result of being recommended for vaccinations. And I think you say this at the outset, the scheme was only intended to be an interim measure. Can you just help with that last bit? In what way was it intended to be an interim measure?
Yes, absolutely. So the Pearson Commission was tasked with the job of looking at personal injury law in the UK and compensation. One of the recommendations that they came up with was to recognise the fact that the vaccine injured and bereaved constitute a special group. They are a group of people who have been injured as a direct result of doing what the government's asked us all to do. They stepped forward and they were vaccinated, and some of them have borne a very serious, in fact devastating consequence of that through death or serious injury. The Pearson Commission recognised this and recommended that a compensation scheme was put in place. However, there was a change of government between 1978 and 1979. So legislation was hastily put together by the Callaghan outgoing government, and then the Thatcher government came in, and that legislation was never finalised or formalised. So what we have at the moment in our Vaccine Damage Payment Act and the scheme that is devised under that act is essentially a sort of a stopgap piece of legislation. It's never been properly thought through, and to date, and I think I can say this on the basis of the evidence that's been given in the last 3 weeks, there seems to have been a sort of governmental or institutional inertia around this particular piece of legislation. It has never been carried over the line in the way that the Pearson Commission intended it to be.
Let me pause you there, because we may come on to look at that. But in essence, for the last 45 years, there has been no reform of that scheme, although there have been various changes that we may look at to the amount of payment and indeed, obviously, the inclusion of COVID-19 vaccinations as falling within the ambit of the scheme.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So it's essentially the 1970s safety net that was hastily put together by the Pearson Commission and hasn't been changed since then.
Just briefly, it might be sensible to look at how the scheme works. And if we could have up on screen, please, paragraphs 22 onwards in Ms Moore's statement. We can see there you've helpfully set out the aims of the Act, and indeed the scheme as it exists, is to provide a single tax-free payment for those who've been damaged either through death or severe disablement, It has to be proved on the balance of probabilities to have been caused by the vaccination. And presently, it amounts to a £120,000 tax-free award.
Correct.
You set out there that in December of 2020, the government announced that COVID-19 vaccines would be added to the Act. And then you go on to deal with some of the detail of the scheme itself. And if we look down, there are various criteria that need to be met, not just geographical. Obviously, the vaccine's got to be within the Act, which COVID-19 is. And if one goes over the page, importantly, in relation to severity of injury, person is or was immediately before his death severely disabled because of vaccination against any of the disease to which the Act applies. Now, we'll look at this disablement provision in a moment. Is this the position, though, that a payment under the scheme does not preclude the bringing of a civil claim?
Yes, that's correct.
And I think you have seen some evidence provided by others to the inquiry, including that by Professor Duncan Fairgrieve, King's Counsel Honorary, who says that redress via civil claims is challenging.
Yes,
is his
absolutely.
word. Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. If I can just speak to that point very briefly, yes, it's extremely challenging. Very many people will not have access to the kinds of litigation that are currently necessitated by the fact that the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme is not fit for purpose. These people have no other way to access redress apart from litigation, but litigation is not an option open to them. So for some people, there is no option to litigate at all, and for others, it presents a formidable challenge, both in terms of the finances and the way in which the law is structured in this area. So it is no mean feat to mount a case against a company like AstraZeneca, particularly in circumstances where we know they are indemnified by the British government. So these people who are vaccine injured and bereaved, these people who've paid the highest price for the vaccination programme, which we of course have all have benefited from, are now being forced, because the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme does not work, to take on the might of vaccine companies and the British government.
All right. I understand, therefore, that all the more reason to try and have a scheme that works for those that can't, for whatever reason, pursue a civil claim.
Yes.
I think, is this the position, though, that unlike a civil claim, there is no requirement to show negligence or any other wrongdoing under the VDPS?
That's right. It's a strict sort of liability, no fault scheme.
No. All right. Now, I think you set out in your statement that in your experience over the last few years, and certainly over 2021 and 2022, there was a significant backlog in processing applications for COVID-19 related damages, and there was essentially a campaign of reform. Can I ask you about this? In your statement, you say that there was a review announced in May 2024
Yes.
of the scheme. Is there any update that you're able to give us, Ms. Moore, since then?
To some extent, yes. So we work with a group called VIB UK, and you've already heard Kate Scott giving
Yes.
evidence in the course of these proceedings. VIB UK were invited to a meeting with Wes Streeting, the Secretary of State for Health, in September. Mr. Streeting has subsequently written to the group and said that he was he was impressed by what the evidence that they provided. He understood the need to look at this very carefully and that the government would do so. Now, we understand from an update received just before Christmas that review process is going on behind the scenes, but to date nothing has come out of it. And I think you can understand in the context of the way in which this legislation was formed in the first place, sort of hastily as a stopgap measure, also as a result of the fact that a review was announced in May 2024 and nothing came of it, that there are some concerns that whilst Mr. Streeting's intentions may be very good, actually what we need to see is action. And these people cannot wait indefinitely. Many of them have waited, 4 years already.
Can we turn to the scheme itself? And I think, Ms. Moore, you're aware that Ms. Scott, in fact, the witness who gave evidence to her ladyship earlier, described the scheme as too little, too late, too few. Pithy,
Yes.
but apposite, I suspect you would agree.
Yes, quite.
All right, can we look at some of those headings, though, too late. May I start with that, please? Are you able to give us a summary, and if it helps you, I'm at paragraph 73 or thereabouts in your statement, of why the application process is taking so long to force through the applications and provide the redress to those applicants?
Well, first of all, I mean, the fact that it is taking a very long time, if I can just speak to that in terms
Yes,
of the
please
data,
do.
if that's helpful. So we know on the basis of a Freedom of Information Act response dated January 2025 that there have been 17,519 applications to the scheme for those specifically injured or bereaved as a result of
Can I pause you there?
COVID-19
Because I'm going to put up on
vaccines. Of course.
screen something that may help you and help everyone else
Sure.
follow the number and the state of the applications in the scheme. Could we have up on screen, please, paragraph 76, which is at 474-459_20. And we're aware, Ms Moore, that there was a Freedom of Information Act request that gave us these figures, but I think, if I understand you correctly, they're updated figures.
Yes, that's correct.
So as at the 9th of September, there were just shy of 15,000 applications. And did you say it's now
Just
over
shy of 18,000, so 17,519.
Right. As at the 9th of September, only 47% had been notified of an outcome. Is there an improvement or not in that regard?
Yes, so now there are 55% of decisions made, so 9,545, we understand. So that's still 18,000 people without a decision. And just to speak to the point of the delays, of those 8,000 who are still, or 8,000 approximately, who are still waiting for a decision, 1,027 people have been waiting for 12 months. 438 people have been waiting for more than 18 months, and 126 people have been waiting for more than 2 years. Now, I know that they are just figures on a page, but to animate those and to speak to the humanity of what those figures actually mean, we have people, one gentleman within our group who has been waiting for 2 years. He suffered a very significant neurological injury as a result of one of the vaccines. And as a consequence of him having to wait so long to receive this £120,000 and his personal circumstances, he has been living in an elderly care home. He's in his mid-40s, and we now understand from the experts with whom we are working that that delay in accessing rehabilitation treatments has impacted his prognosis quite significantly. So it has a real-world impact, this does. Both
Her ladyship's heard some evidence, indeed, from Miss Scott about the impact
Yes.
on her husband, Jamie, who can no longer work. To pick just 2 examples of no doubt many.
Yes.
The scheme was intended to provide prompt support, so clearly those that have been waiting 12, 18, 24 months perhaps are not meeting that intended
Definitely
aim.
not.
You set out in your statement that there were, pre-pandemic, 4 staff dealing with applications into the scheme. And I think now there are something like 80 members of staff. But can I ask you this? Do you think that the government ought to realise sooner that there was likely to be, given the widespread rollout of the vaccination programme, more applications being made, and therefore have more staff and resourcing in place at the outset?
Yes, I think that's got to be the case, hasn't it, logically? If you have an unprecedented vaccine rollout, then you are going to probably have an unprecedented number of adverse events. I don't think that's controversial to say.
Are you able to help us, Ms Moore, with some of the reasons for perhaps the length of time it's taking to process the applications? Clearly there's got to be an application, medical records are sought. What, in your experience, has been the reasons for some of the longer application processes that you've just told us about?
I think obtaining medical records has definitely been a problem that the medical assessment panels have been experiencing. And, you know, as a personal injury lawyer, I have some sympathy with that. It can be very difficult to get hold of medical records, of course. But we are talking about a government service here. So you would think that there would be more ready access to those records. It's also important to remember that some of these people who are making applications to the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme are bereaved. So they are doing so where they already have been through an inquest a coronial process, and they are making this application with the benefit of a confirmed death certificate, which will say on the face of the certificate that the vaccine has caused the death. So in those circumstances, it's very difficult to understand why somebody should be waiting 18 months for a medical assessment panel to make a decision about causation. And of course, very sadly, in a deceased case, the extent of the disability caused is absolute. It's 100%.
There may be a distinction then between the way that where people have died are treated and they have the certificate that shows the link to the vaccine, and those that are injured and have a slightly different route through to receiving an award.
Possibly, sorry, but can I just say that my experience has been very specifically around something called vaccine-induced immune thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, so VIT, which is accepted as caused by the AstraZeneca vaccine specifically. And most of the applications that we've assisted with have been in that context where people have submitted expert reports, so expert haematologists and neurologists reporting on causation, and it is still taking 18 months for those results to come through, or those verdicts from the panel to come through. We know that the medical assessment panel have to be 5 years qualified, but where you have coronial evidence or the best expert evidence in the country assisting them with causation, the delay does seem completely out with what could be done here.
So there's potentially, or certainly at the beginning, a lack of resourcing in terms of people to help the applications be made and processed. There is potentially delays in gaining access to records.
Yes.
Is there any other delay that you're able to point to explain 18 months, 2 years of wait for some of these applicants?
I think some of the problems also come to the point about how the disability test is made, or the eligibility criteria for that. So perhaps I can speak to that.
Yes, I was going to come on to that, please. And it's really, I suppose, under the too few banner. The criteria that need to be met, as I think was set out in your statement, is one of 60% disablement. Can you just help us with what that looks like in the real world? What is really trying to be assessed there?
Just before you answer Ms. Carey's question, could I ask you to avoid naming specific companies?
Of course.
Because of litigation pending and...
Of course, my apologies.
No,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady, and I'll try and be alert to that too. It's my fault, Miss Moore. Can we come back to the too few and the disablement criteria, and just help us with an overview of what really is being asked of the applicant in that part of the process?
Yes, so, I mean, I can try to explain the 60%, but actually it's sort of beyond rational explanation, because this is a test that comes from, as I understand it, Social Security legislation. I think it's Schedule 2 of the 1982 regulations, where there is a list of percentages attributed to specific types of injury. If you look at that schedule, they're all in the context of amputations or visual impairment. Deafness, I think, is also listed. And you will see that 60% equals below-knee amputation. There is also a percentage for the amputation of a hand or a finger or a thumb, or various other parts of the body. And that is the 60% test that is used at the moment for the vaccine damage payment scheme. Now, where we are talking about neurological injuries of the sort that Kate Scott outlined during her evidence, you can see that there is quite a big gap, or quite a gymnastic calculation that needs to be done for the medical assessment panel to work out whether a brain injury the size of a credit card is equal or greater than a below-the-knee amputation. Now, quite why the scheme is still working with that calibration in place, it's very difficult to understand, but I think it must be very difficult for the medical assessment panel to make those calculations as well.
Yeah, at what point does 59% become 60%, or I follow
it's incredibly subjective, and I think that is also makes the scheme very opaque, and it makes it very difficult for them to sort of trust the veracity of the results coming out. And the people who are making the applications to the scheme are, of course, in extremis by definition. You don't make an application unless you feel you've suffered a significant injury.
you say in your statement, certainly on the figures as they were in the autumn of 2024, that of the nearly 15,000 applications, 6,845 of those that had been notified of an outcome had claims that were rejected. And when a rejection is issued, does it tell the applicant you failed because you didn't meet the 60% threshold? Or does it tell you you failed because you didn't prove causation?
Both.
Both.
So
All right.
it will tell you whether or not you've met the causation test, and you may meet the causation test, but you may not meet the disability threshold. So you may fall below 60%.
So maybe we take it that when you say in your statement of the claims that had been notified of an outcome, 97% of those claims were rejected. Is that because they didn't meet the 60% disablement threshold?
That's both.
Both,
So we know
right.
that there's around a 2% acceptance rate, which I should say is the lowest in the world based on data that's now coming out of Oxford University. We have the slowest scheme in the world based on that Oxford University study, and we have the scheme with the lowest acceptance rate as well. But of the 9,000 now, 351 rejected, around 416 of those people were rejected because they didn't meet the 60% test. So those people receive a report from the VDPS which says, we accept that the vaccine caused this injury, but you are not disabled enough to be eligible for compensation of any sort or payment of any sort by the government. And again, to speak to the humanity of that, that's very difficult for somebody to understand why they are 45%, which in realistic terms may mean that their life is devastated. They cannot go back to work. They cannot care for their children. But that is not recognised as being disabled enough for the purposes of the current scheme.
Yeah. All right. Too little, please. We
Yes.
know that the award was raised to 120,000 in 2007, but there has been no even inflation adjustment since then. I think you've assessed that if it had been adjusted for inflation, it would be now somewhere in the region of 196,000.
That's correct.
Right. This is not compensation. I make that clear, but an award to try and help the rehabilitation process, people deal with whatever immediate needs they may have. But clearly there are some people who may be so injured by the vaccine they're unable to work again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what we've got at the moment is such a significant gap between what can be achieved under the VDPS and what could be achieved through civil litigation, albeit that path is very difficult for people to tread and impossible for some. The fact of that gap is actually necessitating litigation because people have no choice but to litigate. I mean, even if you're 59% injured and you cannot access statutory compensation, statutory financial support, then, you know, what are you supposed to do? And if you are in a situation where, to take Kate Scott's example again, you know, your husband will never be able to go back to work, you are a full-time carer and you have 2 children, £120,000 is woefully inadequate. Nobody wants to litigate. I can speak to that. I'm not going to speak specifically about the litigation, of course, but you know, nobody really wants to be taking on a vaccine company and the British government. You know, they have other things to do with their lives: pick up the pieces of bereavement, care for those who've been, you know, who suffered devastating injuries.
Right. Can I just pause you there, because clearly you've alluded to a number of potential problems with the scheme. It's too slow. It's very difficult to potentially satisfy the 60% disablement, and on any view, the 120,000 for people who have many working years left and can no longer work. It is a drop in the ocean, if I may put it colloquially. Yes. Is there any appeal process for those who have had their claims rejected?
Yes, there is, and actually the experience of people with whom we've been working is that quite often they are successful on appeal, but again, that's further delay. And I think that also raises some doubt about the validity of the initial assessments. There is a lot of subjectivity in this process, but yes, there is an appeal.
So I think you said if anyone wants to read more about it, they can read it in your witness statement. Can I ask about a couple of other discrete areas, please? In relation to the scheme generally, do you have any views or observations to make about the awareness of the scheme and the profile that it received or didn't, perhaps? And if it helps you, I'm at paragraphs 50 and 51 in your statement, Ms Moore. Was there much publicity about the possibility of making an application if you did, in fact, receive a vaccine-related injury?
My understanding is that there wasn't. Certainly the people with whom we were speaking at the beginning of 2021 and throughout 2021 were not aware of the fact of the vaccine damage payment scheme. Quite rightly, the government put a lot of money and energy into promoting the vaccines, encouraging people to come forward for the vaccines, but I don't think there was any or perhaps only a very small budget put into the vaccine damage payment scheme, alerting people to the fact of that.
Were you aware, or are you aware, of any publicity or awareness raising that was aimed at ethnic minority communities or those that may face additional barriers in accessing information? Do you know if any work was done in that area to try and publicise the scheme to people who may have been injured?
I'm not aware of any.
And I think you say in your statement that initially the application was not easy to fill in, just the practicalities of making an application. I think there was no way to apply online.
No way to apply online in the context of a pandemic where we were in lockdown and you couldn't leave your house. You had to print out the application form, if you had a printer, fill it out in ink, and then take it to the post box.
Yeah. Clearly, some people would prefer a paper form, some people prefer online. But
necessary to have the choice. And also, there was no box for bereavement. Yeah. So the form, as it was initially constituted, didn't allow applicants to indicate that they were applying on behalf of a deceased loved one. So they had to literally draw in the box and tick it. So that form was woefully inadequate. Little or no thought, I think it's fair to say, was put into how that form would work for people in the context of a mass population vaccination rollout.
I think the inquiry has heard evidence, and certainly you've seen in the documents that provided to you, that in Scotland, the Scottish Social Security Department provided a service to help people complete the actual forms. Do you know whether there was any similar resources or services provided in England, Wales and Northern Ireland?
Not that I'm aware of, and anecdotally, based on my experience, I think that must be the case because people were coming to us as a law firm and asking for help, and they were finding us through various routes, and there were support groups, sort of grassroots groups of people starting to get together and think, well, what can we do here? And they formed, just like VIB UK, their own support network because there was nothing institutional in place. What VIB UK did try to do quite early on, and Housefeld, the law firm I was with at the time, tried to support this, was to set up a website where people could be signposted through the vaccine damage payment scheme system and through the benefit system and all of the mess, the necessary mess that comes after a serious injury or bereavement. And that was taken down by Facebook because it was, we presume, flagged as being in some way anti-vaccination, which of course it was not. So no, I think people were left with nowhere to go and no clear pathway in terms of accessing financial support.
No. Do you know if now, in 2025, there are any services provided to help an applicant fill in the form, citizens' advice, or that's not a lawyer?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure the great work that citizens' advice bureaus do, perhaps there are people available. But no, I'm not aware of any scheme put in place. I should say that the awareness of the scheme has probably increased. The number of applications going into the scheme has massively increased. So there is probably better general awareness, but that general awareness has been born, I think, of headlines, advocacy by groups affected, rather than any concerted initiative by the government. As conceived of by the Pearson Commission originally, the point of a vaccine damage payment scheme, I think, was to shore up vaccine confidence.
Yes.
It was seen very much as going hand in hand with, encouraging people to step forward for vaccination. So it seems to me, if I can suggest, that the government has missed a trick here. You know, there could have been concerted effort into saying vaccines are, for the most part, safe, but when the worst things happen, we will be there. There will be a meaningful safety net. And we haven't heard that narrative at all, as far as I understand it, so far from the government.
Can I turn then to a slightly wider issue? Clearly, there's a statutory footing for the scheme. But can I ask you about, pending any statutory change, which may take a long time and be very difficult to get through government and Parliament, are there any short-term or more immediate recommendations that you would urge Her Ladyship to consider to perhaps ameliorate some of the problems with the scheme that you've told us about this morning?
Yes, absolutely. I think we understand that any statutory reform would be forward-facing, and we understand, based on discussions with West Streeting, that it would require a lot of parliamentary time, and that, of course, would need to be done incredibly carefully, and that work must be done. But as a more immediate solution here, there could be the possibility of setting up a bespoke compensation scheme or support scheme specifically for those who've been injured or bereaved as a consequence of COVID-19 vaccinations. That would be, I think, a swifter measure to put in place. We know that there are, a large number of people who have been vaccinated and bereaved. We know that for a proportion of them, causation has already been established. We know that some of them haven't got any compensation at all because they've not met that 60% threshold. But that is a defined group of people for whom a proper financial support system could be put in place now, or quite rapidly, I would suggest. We are very good in the UK at thinking up bespoke schemes, you know, from the Thalidomide Trust back in the 1980s through to the VCJD, the Mad Cow, the BSE bespoke scheme, right through to the infected blood scheme. You know, we do have the wherewithal as a consequence of academic work, legal experts, to think through sensible schemes that balance the need to ensure people are given fair amounts of money to support them, but also are not too onerous on the public purse, and recognise the fact that these people, through no fault of their own, have suffered these devastating consequences. It could have been any of us, and I think as a society to move to do that would be potentially, if you'll excuse the pun, a shot in the arm for vaccine confidence, because this would be the government, I think, recognising the necessity of holding up their end of the social contract, the pact that is formed between a government and a community when we are asked to step up for vaccination.
Ms Moore, thank you very much. They are all the questions that I had for you. Is there any question your ladyship would like to ask?
Essentially, the whole point about having, for those who are not lawyers, I've got a husband who's a personal injury lawyer, so I understand a bit about it, did some work myself. But for those who don't understand, there's the difference between a grant or an award, which is basically the vaccine damage payment scheme as it is, and compensation is compensation assesses the damage that's been caused and what you're going to need to lead your as effective a life as you can lead with your disability.
Yes, that's right.
And what you're suggesting is that we move from the award system, the grant system, to a compensation system.
I think there is space in between. So at the moment we've got sort of two completely juxtaposed situations where we have a scheme that provides £120,000, or, as I'm sure you know, and your husband will definitely know, for sort of significant neurological injuries, you'd be looking at sort of millions of pounds of damages. Now, there is probably some space in between there, and that gap could be closed, is my point. If we don't close that gap, then litigation is going to be necessitated. And I think that litigation is bad for everybody. It's bad for the vaccine companies. It's very bad for the people who are having to go through that process, the people that I represent. But I think it's also bad for public confidence and the wider sort of public health policy point. The government have indemnified the vaccine companies, quite rightly, so they are paying out for the litigation which is ongoing. They will pay out for compensation in the end if it's successful. They're paying out through the VDPS and all the administrative costs of that. That could all be streamlined by having a sensible scheme that's put in place that is somewhere between the civil compensation standards and the current statutory amount. And I think that could actually solve a lot of the issues that we've seen over the last few years and have the added bonus of potentially increasing vaccine confidence.
You mentioned in your statement about how funds in other countries are, how resources are provided for funds, and you mentioned a levy on pharmaceutical companies. Is it Sweden or Scandinavia?
Yes, Scandinavia, I think Sweden specifically, yes. So that's right. So in accessing the market, essentially the country, with a vaccination programme, the vaccine companies are asked to pay a certain krona, or whatever it is in Sweden, into essentially a public pot, so that in the event that these rare consequences happen, there is a pot of money that will facilitate proper compensation. I think that has the benefit of also making sure that the risks are partially privatised, as well as the benefits being socialised. I think what we do there is that we recognise that between the public sector and the private sector, there are benefits and responsibilities, and the best way to make sure that those funds are adequate is probably to do that. We've seen that with the Thalidomide Trust, which is partially paid into by the company involved there as well. And those schemes then can be very well resourced, I think, with advantages for everybody. To me, if I may say, Lady Chair, it is shocking that we have a 1970s system that we have done nothing to reform, particularly in a context like we are today, post-pandemic. It was perhaps forgivable in the immediate sort of circumstances of the pandemic, but now, this many years on, I think the case for reform is overwhelming, and I would argue that the case for a bespoke compensation scheme is significant and urgent.
Another question. One of the advantages of the scheme when established was meant to be speed. I take your point about speed, that there not being the speed that was intended. But the more you go into how an individual is actually damaged, as you say, the longer it's going to take, the more complex the medical reports are going to be. Finding the specialists who can provide you with the reports is going to take time. To what extent do you lose the speed, if it were there? So let's
presume it's
let's
there.
Push that to one side for a second. To what extent do you lose the speed when you go into the detail of individual cases?
I think there's got to be a balance. You're absolutely right. But we do see speedy schemes that work on the basis of banding. Again, the Thalidomide Trust is one of those. The VCJD scheme is one of those. The infected blood scheme, obviously, it's just in its nascence, but will enable faster decisions to be made because bandings can be put in place. So it's not that there's a bespoke sort of analysis of each individual case, but there could be criteria through which more rapid decisions could be made, which still took full account of the injuries and the personals and the individual's experiences. At the moment, it's a one-size-fits-all, and we know that just doesn't work on the basis of the evidence that you've heard over the last few weeks, I think.
Going back to your point, sorry, I'm losing my voice for a reason. Going back to your point about the criterion of 60% disability. Supposing the government said we're going to keep the vaccine damage payment scheme, but we're prepared to look at the criterion. The Equality Act has a definition for disability, as I'm sure you're aware. I think it's substantial, was it physical or mental impairment which has substantial and long-term effects on daily life. And I wondered about that as a possible criterion, except it talks about long-term effects. And of course the point is, as you say, we're trying to get money to people who need it sooner. So just supposing the scheme stayed in place, what criterion would you suggest should be put in instead of the 60%?
So I think we would need to have some assessment of the severity of the injury in the first instance, and then you could have multiples. So there's a scheme called COVAX, which is something which was set up during the course of the pandemic, and actually the British government paid into that scheme, and that's for 92 lower and middle-income countries across the world, and they have multiples based on severity from 0.25% up to 1.5%. So there is a calibration by severity. I don't think you can avoid that, and I think we would have to see the extent of the neurological or the personal injuries. But then that could be, we could also factor in future prognosis into that. There is enough learning and wherewithal within the UK based on, for example, the Judicial College guidelines, precedents, and all the other data for us to be able to develop a sophisticated scheme, I think, that can take account of that. And we have really good examples of these already. I don't think we necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We've got a pretty good map of what wheels should look like from other bespoke schemes, and I think we could draw upon those.
Bespokes and wheels. I think we better probably do it, haven't we?
Yeah, quite.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Ms. Moore. I have no other questions, and I don't think there are any call participant questions.
No, not.
I'm really grateful to you for your help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. Thank you, Ms. Moore. My lady, the next witness this morning is Lord James Bethell, and it will just take a moment for him to come in. Can I just have the water? Thanks. Oh my gosh, it was quite elegant. My lady, may Lord Bethell please be sworn or affirm?
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Lord Beth, I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long.
Lord Bethell, some formalities. Your full name, please.
James Bethell.
You've made a statement to the inquiry dated, I think, the 6th of October of last year, and I'd like to ask you about a number of different topics, please. Can I start with a little background about you? Is this right, that on the 9th of March you were confirmed formally as the Minister for Technology and Life Sciences, and you were indeed the House of Lords Minister responsible for representing all health matters and legislation in the House of Lords? We know from your statement that you had ministerial oversight of the antivirals task force, the therapeutics task force, the combined task force, and as you set out, you sat on a number of engagement boards and indeed other forum, both for antivirals, therapeutics and other groups.
That is correct. I think it's worth adding that I had been a whip to the health department since the summer before, so I had been involved in the proceedings of the department.
Thank you. May I ask about some initial observations that you make in your statement? And you say early on in your statement of paragraph 7 that clearly there was a recommendation to explore existing common medicines to see if that might have an impact on COVID-19. And you say this: our initial efforts faltered because of the weaknesses in our clinical trials system. And can I ask you please at the outset for an overview of what, from your perspective, were those weaknesses?
I think there were three main areas of weakness. One was about selecting the commonly used drugs that should be put to trial. That really needed clear leadership. We had very strong expert groups, but it is difficult to get an expert group to coalesce around a short list, and therefore we needed a better mechanism for doing that. Secondly, in terms of recruitment, it was extremely problematic to get people into the trials, and that was partly data, partly trying to get clinicians to prioritise clinical trials, and partly just a clunky way in which the NHS was working around trials in that date. Those were resolved, but in an early stage they were very weak.
When you say early stages, are we talking March, April, May 2020?
Yes, we're talking exactly.
Right.
And then thirdly was actually liaising with the manufacturers themselves to get guidance from them about what they thought would work. We had great academic leadership, but life sciences is best done when the academics, the clinicians, and the industry work together, and that wasn't happening very well at the beginning.
Do I take it from what you said that it improved over time?
It did. The system kicked in a big way, and the recovery trial, which went on to deliver huge results, was a good example of that.
Right. May I ask you, in respect of those three weaknesses you've identified, did you take in your role any steps to try and address or remedy those weaknesses? And if so, what did you do?
Yes, there was a big program of trying to accelerate momentum in this. There were observers from outside. Some of the clinical advice I got from people like Sir John Bell was that this needed to be accelerated much faster. So we looked at appointing external leads, people who could come in from industry to try to lead the program, and some names were looked at for that. But really what made a big difference was having people like Professor Landry and Professor Hornby, trusted clinicians who knew how to drive clinical trials, put at the centre of the organisation.
I think you say that for future pandemics, we need a more robust emergency clinical trial system that can be stood up more quickly on a bigger scale, as with the decision-making around trial drugs. Who do you think, Lord Bethell, or which department do you think should be responsible for setting up an emergency clinical trial system?
Well, that's for sure, in terms of departments, the Department for Health and Social Care. But I think that the coordination between the NHS, the universities, and the industry needs to be much, much clearer. Lord O'Shaughnessy has done an extremely good report on this. It has crystal clear recommendations. They need to be driven much harder than they are at the moment.
Can I ask you this? Do you consider now, looking back over your time, that vaccines were prioritised over therapeutics?
No, I think that's a false dichotomy. They are very different children. We weren't choosing one child over another. With vaccines, we have a specialism in the UK so that we know a lot about the science, and the challenge was a lot about seeing through the clinical trials and then ultimately the deployment. So in that respect, although there are severe obstacles, it's relatively linear. It is relatively straightforward, and the things you're going to be worried about are there are known unknowns. With therapeutics, it's a completely different kettle of fish. It's extremely complex. There are lots of different types of therapeutics and antivirals. The population itself changes as vaccination is rolled out. There are lots of different types of responses from individuals. It's highly personalized. The delivery of different medicines is completely different. Some might need an infusion into the arm that takes hours. Some might be in a pill. Some need to be taken in advance, some afterwards. And also the clinical trials were bouncing around an enormous amount. So that's a five-sided Rubik's Cube, which requires a completely different approach than vaccines.
I understand that the dichotomy, or the false dichotomy as you call it, is not one that you have experienced yourself, but do you think there is a perception, nonetheless, that vaccines were prioritised over therapeutics?
Yeah. Listen, the success of the vaccines programme is something that we can celebrate as a nation, and the therapeutic programme didn't have the same profile.
Why not?
Well, because it wasn't on TV every night. Huge amounts of work by very dedicated teams who were very focused on outcomes was done in the background, and they delivered tremendous results, which have saved many, many lives. So I think it's an unsung success for the UK in many ways.
So it didn't get the attention it deserved?
No, that attention is different to profile. The fact that it wasn't on the front pages of newspapers doesn't mean that it wasn't focused on by both the government and the NHS.
Right. Didn't get the profile it deserved.
Profile in the newspapers, but you don't measure saving lives in column inches.
No, understood. So from your perspective, there was focus on both vaccines and the therapeutics. And from your perspective, was there ever, in your view, a hesitancy or a reluctance to pursue therapeutics with the force that the vaccine programme was rolled out?
Well, there were practicalities. In the very early days, it was assumed that the answer to this novel virus was going to be a therapeutic strategy. At the very beginning, we had no medicines at all to treat it. People were coming into hospital and being treated with paracetamol, and if they deteriorated, were being intubated. That is a terrible position to be in. So we worked hard on therapeutics, and things like remdesivir came through that meant that we could treat people who were poorly. And that's a phenomenal thing that Britain really made a big contribution in doing. Quite quickly, so we're talking April, May June, the signals from the vaccine programme became much more encouraging than I guess at first we would have thought they would have been. And so quite reasonably, that became a focus because we needed to stand up the delivery of the vaccine. But all along, we knew that we needed a fallback plan. The vaccine could have, we were one phone call from disaster. We just needed to know about a clinical trial that had gone badly wrong, and then we would have to go to plan B. So the therapeutics were very much seen as that plan B. And certainly from my point of view, I had a grave sense of urgency and importance in order to make sure that we delivered a fallback plan. And secondly, the vaccine might not have worked for everyone. And definitely for some people, therapeutics and antivirals were going to be very important.
We're going to come on to look at some of those matters, Lord Bethell. Can I start, though, with one of the topics that I'd ask you about is the Accord programme. And can you just help us, for those who are not familiar with it, what was the aim of Accord and what was it trying to achieve?
Well, Accord programme was, as you said earlier, trying to look at some of the drugs that were already in use. So we wouldn't need to have to go through huge numbers of trials, which would take years to do. It's a very, very common approach, and it, in terms of its mission, did ultimately lead to some successes.
I think it was announced on towards the end of April of 2020, and it really focused on trying to improve the treatments for the more serious symptoms that COVID had, and try and stop people progressing to the severe complications that we saw. You wrote, I think, in May, on the 26th of May, to the Secretary of State, Mr. Hancock, concerned at the slow progress of Accord. And can I just look, please, on screen at INQ 486320. And if we see there in the middle of the page, an email from you asking to update the Secretary of State with the following note relating to Accord. As you'll remember, this is going to be done by the private sector, but UKRI grabbed it at the last minute. Based on the recent oversight committee, it's going very slowly. Initially, problems getting the trial medicines, now problems recruiting the trial patients. For example, drugs have been in recruitment for weeks, but only one recruit, many have none. Alok Sharma is battling hard to make progress. It's a hugely important project to mobilise established drugs for COVID treatment. Why were you so keen to let Mr. Hancock know that there was problems with the Accord programme?
The Accord programme was extremely well intentioned, but it fell into the worst of the bureaucratic and low energy approach to clinical trials that may work well for academic study, but were not suitable for either an emergency or the very large scale challenge that we had. I sat in meetings on a weekly basis in order to go through progress, and had quite a detailed understanding of where we were going. And you only had to look at the arithmetic progress to realise that the epidemic was going to be over before we came up with a solution. In particular, recruitment was simply way off the scale we needed, and therefore I was recommending a reboot, which did in fact happen and led to recovery, which moved much more quickly.
Now, recovery was, I think, a little later or something running alongside this, but here we are a month into Accord and it's already making slow progress. Was there any noticeable uptake, you having emailed the Secretary of State and, as you say, encouraging Alok Sharma to battle hard and make progress?
No, I think this was an approach problem rather than a lack of scrutiny problem. Alok was doing everything he could do. But listen, the way in which an intellectual, academic-led organisation like UKRI does clinical trials is simply completely off the pace when it comes to an epidemic. And we moved on to a different approach.
All right, I was going to ask you about that, please, because certainly you wrote to Alok Sharma on the 23rd of June. Could we have on screen INQ 0004789777, where you're writing to him to suggest how we might move forward with a renewed national programme for clinical trials. And you set out it's important to test repurposed drugs through large-scale trials. And you note your disappointment with recruitment in relation to Accord. And towards the bottom of the page, Lord Bethell, you say, I want to also share my thoughts on how to build on all the work in this space to date, particularly learning what works and what does not. And you say there, It's essential that research is driven by clinical need with a rigorous focus on finding treatments. You suggest that the CMO or DCMO should lead on identifying the critical questions. This should be delivered primarily through a new single lead national trials programme for COVID-19 therapeutics. And then there was other suggestions on the second page of that. But it's really that final line there, Lord Bethel, the new single lead national trials programme for COVID-19 therapeutics. Why were you so keen to advocate for such a programme?
The problems with Accord and actually some other trials that were going on were very typical of the problems we have in our clinical trials system in the UK overall. And we were trying to apply ordinary day-to-day practices to an emergency situation. And the system creaked badly. Actually, what we needed to have had before the epidemic hit us was a program for warp speed style acceleration and central decision making. The reference here to the CMO leading on identifying critical questions refers to what I said earlier about identifying the compounds that should go into the system. And having a national trials program refers in part to that liaison with industry and with the NHS so that prioritisation could be given to these trials. And that should be a recommendation that I'd like to put to the inquiry, that this should be in place for when the next epidemic comes along.
And who would you envisage leading the programme or being responsible for it? DHSC again?
Well, I'm agnostic about institutionally where that should be. DHSC isn't really a clinical organisation and often during the epidemic stepped in when there was a gap. So it could be UXA, it could be an updated JCVI. There are a number of possible homes. Certainly someone like Professor Van Tam did provide personally the kind of leadership that we needed. And I'd like to see that institutionalised rather than relying on individuals stepping up to solving problems.
I think just finally on this topic, I think you chaired a round table in relation to clinical trials reform, and you made a call for a renewed national programme.
Yes.
What happened in response to your call, Lord Bethel?
Well, we got a lot of very good papers. I happen to remember Baroness Blackwood, my predecessor, and Lord O'Shaughnessy both putting in papers that were very thoughtful. And it did provide some energy and some focus. Be part of research, the very good scheme were involved in some of the response, and there were individual programs to try to accelerate clinical trials of the kind that I would like to see more of. I fear that since then, a lot of that energy has fallen back, and in fact, clinical trials in the UK have fallen back in quite a worrying way since that moment of energy.
A slightly different topic in relation to clinical
So
trials.
just before you move on, if I may, you say you think that you fear that the clinical trials have fallen back. Apart from the national, do you believe that if there were a national trials programme, that would solve the problems you've been identifying, or are there other things that would need to be in place to solve the problems?
I'm afraid that the problem to our COVID trials is a list of about 20 things. So having one programme is a good way of providing leadership and structure, but there's a lot more things that need to be done, and I could drop a note if that would be helpful with that.
Thank you very much.
It's not the silver bullet, but it is part of the way
Correct.
to solving the problem. I understand. Just on a wider angle in relation to clinical trials, did you take any measures as Minister to address the lack of diversity in clinical trials and help ensure that there was adequate representation of ethnic minorities, particularly given we know the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 had on those communities?
Yes, well, getting equality in clinical trials is a massive priority of any clinical trial system. I don't think I necessarily had to drive that hard. It is a priority for anyone organising the testing of drugs, and in particular, both gender, ethnic, and any other kind of diversity. So I think that was uppermost in everyone's minds. Certainly, issues like pregnant women, which I think has come up before in the inquiry, were things that came up in our conversations. I drove as hard as I could.
Were you aware of any specific efforts to try and drive up diversity within ethnic minorities?
Not off the top of my head. I'd have to refer to my papers for that.
Thank you. Can I turn to some questions about antivirals, please? And if it helps you, Lord Bethell, I'm at paragraphs 59 and 60 onwards in your statement. We are moving forwards in time, I think, to 2021. And you set out there that in February 2021, you received plans for the proposed antivirals programme to look at 3 effective antivirals. And there was a proposal put to you, I think, that Charlotte Taylor shared with you and the Secretary of State, setting out the plan. Clearly, you say there it was important because the vaccine was not 100% effective, and not everyone can have it. And so there was a need for the antivirals. And you say this in your statement, that you were excited about the antivirals programme, noting, to quote you, it was a really impressive piece of work. Just help us. What was it about the programme that enthused you?
Well, I think that we were grabbing it and something was being done. I think that there is as you said yourself, that it didn't get the profile of the vaccine programme, but actually there were some very ambitious and high energy work that was being done. I could see, like everyone, that there were gaps in the vaccine delivery mechanism. There were going to be people who didn't respond to the vaccine. There was also the chance that the variant would escape the vaccine, that suddenly we would be dealing with a new virus that was not easily controlled by our plan A. That was very much on my mind. It seems an odd thing to be worried about in retrospect, but right then, in February 2021, I didn't want to be walking into another epidemic because the virus had somehow jumped the shark and become immune to the vaccine. So having that in place was a really big priority, and I was impressed by the team's work.
Do you know, I know you left, I think in September 2021,
Yeah.
but had there been a discernible improvement or outcome as a result of the programme that was being suggested to you back in February of that year?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so by the time you left office, effectively, had you seen the benefit of the fruits of the antivirals programme?
Well, yes. They had, Eddie had done a good job of identifying key antivirals that could potentially be put to use. But in some ways, history had moved on. The vaccine programme had delivered for most of the population a really good protection, certainly from severe disease and death. It didn't stop transmission. It didn't stop long COVID. It didn't work for absolutely everyone. But broadly speaking, it was a route to escaping the epidemic. So in some ways, this work was less important than it had been in February.
You say in your statement that regarding antivirals, you believe we might have been more creative about the possible ways we could mobilise antivirals using modern diagnostic, digital and delivery technologies there. What were you trying to say in that statement, Lord Bethell?
Sure. So the big problem with antivirals is you need to give them to people before they show symptoms, really. Once your nose is running and you're coughing, it's probably too late. The medicine can't get in early enough. I take antivirals for a condition I have, so I know this personally to be true. In order to get antivirals into someone before they show symptoms, you kind of need to know, you need to get them to them very, very quickly. For instance, on a motorbike, the moment that they test positive. So you need to test and treat. And also you maybe give them to other people in their household or in their care home because they are most likely to catch the disease from the infected person. I felt that within the NHS, we could have been more creative about test, trace and treat, and within care home communities, within prophylactically giving people antivirals and having them available for moments of outbreak.
So from your perspective, they had a dual benefit, potentially, for those who needed them once they had early symptoms, but indeed for those pre-symptoms to try and
It was
prevent them.
prophylactic and
I
treatment.
understand. All right. Now, you say in that paragraph the we could mobilise. Who's the we that you're referring
Yes.
to there?
I think that in terms of the delivery mechanisms, I'm really thinking about the NHS. Antivirals are very commonly used medicine. They are regularly very difficult to get to people at the right moment. So this is a long-standing complexity within our treatment system. Our treatment system relies on people falling ill, having a symptom, and then going to the GP. That is a very reactive way of doing medicine. And I'm making the observation that there are ways of trying to use data and home diagnostics to spot people much earlier on, and therefore get the kinds of medicines that catch disease at a very early stage to knock it out before the symptoms emerge. That is the way medicine is going across the board. And in order for our health system to be up to date and ready for the next epidemic, it's worth us thinking today about how we put in place those kinds of mechanisms.
Now, you say candidly in your paragraph 68 that you think we could have been more creative. We were perhaps put off by the initial costs of the drugs and the prospects of huge unaffordable bills. Can you help us, please, perhaps with that tension about the costs, the creativity, the need to protect those for whom the vaccine may not work? Was this, people just saying it's just too expensive?
No, so there are two separate things. So antivirals typically are very cheap. They're short molecules, pretty easy to make once you've got them. Biologics can be incredibly expensive. It's sort of like claret wine. I think Professor Van Tam explained the manufacture of it is incredibly complicated. Also, you have to infuse people. So often they have to go to a hospital and sit in a chair for an hour or two and then be observed afterwards. So there are practical challenges with delivering some of these medicines. Some of them have high costs, some of them have got low costs. There's then the actual delivery mechanism, the use of motorcycles and also issuing large amounts of drugs to households on a preemptive basis. So we did do that with diagnostics. We essentially gave every household an LFD, a lateral flow device, so that they could use it the moment that someone in the household was spotted with the disease. It is possible that if you had the right antiviral, you could do roughly the same thing and issue them very widely. Of course, we're talking there massive costs. So yes, money is a consideration.
Coming on to the test, trace, treat option, you say in your statement that you had early discussions about trialling a test, trace and treat option whereby a household or care home would receive a delivery of the antivirals by bike for the non-symptomatic. But you say it was unfortunate this approach was not pursued more emphatically early on, as it was offered strong potential for containing the spread of the disease. Why wasn't it pursued, and who did not pursue it?
Well, I think it's unfortunate because we might need it in the next epidemic. Actually, in this epidemic, the sequence of it was that we didn't identify effective antivirals till later, by which time, frankly, the vaccine had got it mostly covered. By the time of the next epidemic, we should be in place where we are studying the right antivirals against the right diseases in advance and have the delivery mechanism stood up beforehand so that we have this alternative platform to respond to a disease. Otherwise, we'll be scrambling again as we were. And we shouldn't put all of our eggs in the vaccine basket, because next time round, maybe the vaccine won't be the one that comes through. We'll be relying on therapeutics and antivirals for our primary response.
I think you've explained there perhaps why it wasn't pursued, but who or which department was the impediment to the pursuit of this potential option?
I wasn't aware of an obstacle. A lot of people were very busy, and it didn't get prioritised. I think partly because, frankly, NHS and primary care in particular were flat out in the response and didn't have the spare capacity to look at this interesting but secondary mechanism.
Final question on this topic, please. Do you know, was any thought given to trialling this option on a small geographical area or in some way just seeing if indeed it fact worked and what the logistical problems may or may not be and the success or otherwise of this option. Was that ever thought about?
It's funny you should say that because I think it was, but when I went through my papers to try and find details of it, I couldn't find it. So I apologise for that, and I'm afraid I can't give a conclusive answer.
All right, not at all. My lady, I'm moving on to a totally different topic. Would that be a convenient moment?
Certainly,
for a
I hope
break?
you're warned that we take a break, Lord Bethel, but I promise you we will finish your evidence shortly after we return, I'm sure. I shall return at 25 past.
All right.
It's Kerry.
Thank you, my lady. Lord Bethel, may we turn, please, to some of the work you did in relation to the immunocompromised members of society, and in particular, if it helps you, paragraph 69 onwards in your statement. Now, the inquiry has already heard that in February of 2021, the CMO and DCMO decided not to buy Evusheld, subsequently known as Astronaut, and there's various other ways in which it's referred to, for use as a prophylactic for the immunocompromised. Do I take it from that it was not your decision to not go ahead with that purchase? Were you consulted on the CMO and DCMO's decision not to purchase?
What was the date of their...
February 2021.
So
What they advised.
I wasn't consulted in terms of their decision in their submission.
Yeah.
Their submission did come to me, and I think I commented on it. I had, though, been a champion for measures to try to meet the concerns of the immunocompromised and had a huge amount of sympathy for the situation that they were in.
May I, it wasn't their decision, but it was their recommendation not to purchase Evusheld, and I ought to correct myself before
Yes,
there be any misunderstandings. Did you agree with the recommendation not to buy Evusheld?
Yes, of course. If the CMO puts in a thoughtful, substantial evidence submission, a recommendation like that, then absolutely one would go along with that.
Now, I ask you that because certainly by the 19th of February of 2021, you were emailed Matt Hancock to ask about the strategy for the immunocompromised. And can we have on screen, please, INQ 000 497 981? And at the top of the page, can we see there an email effectively between the private secretaries, but from you to him? Lord Bethel fed back on this. He's inclined to agree, but before he would like to ask what is our strategy for the immunocompromised who cannot take the vaccine or who might not be protected by the vaccine, and how are we going to protect them? And what was the answer to the questions that you were posing of the Secretary of State there?
Well, in some ways, the answer was a large investment in therapeutics and antivirals, and also a research program led by NIHR around it that it included the Octave clinical trials and research. So there was activity in order to try to answer this question. I think the reason why I flagged this to the Secretary of State is that I did want that activity to be thoughtfully coordinated, and that this is one group, and there were many groups, the autistic, the homeless, who were particularly hard hit by this horrible virus. And given the state of where we were in terms of the national response, it seemed to me important that there was some kind of leadership that targeted the situation they were in.
Was there, certainly whilst you were involved, someone put in place to provide that thoughtful coordination of not just the immunocompromised, but all of the other hardest hit?
Well, I think
communities?
Collectively, the response came from our collective actions. You couldn't necessarily appoint a czar for every single group. It did occur to me, though, that because the situation that the immunocompromised were in was particularly complicated, and where the data was particularly patchy, it was worthy of focus.
I think in response to that email, there was a strategy that was devised in March of 2021. And I won't go through all of it, but did the strategy, to your mind, alleviate the concerns that you're raising on behalf of the immunocompromised?
Well, yes and no. Yes, that it was a strategy and it was the best response we could come up with. But no, because I felt heartbroken that there wasn't more that we could do. If you have a virus that attacks the immune system and a vaccine that supports the immune system, those with compromised immune systems are particularly hard hit. So some of these questions don't have great answers, frankly.
You say not more we could do. Do I take it from the answer that you gave that it was inherent with the problems that COVID causes, we couldn't do more? Or is there anything that actually could be done more at ministerial level, departmental level?
Well, not wishing to avoid the question, concretely, what more could have been done is to have had a plan for the immunocompromised before we began. And I'm happy to talk about that if that would.
Well, I suspect let me follow the thread through and then we'll perhaps come back to that, Lord Bethell. So there was a strategy devised in March of 2021, and as you set out in your statement, you met in July of 2021. There was a meeting with the immunocompromised where there was the Department of Health and Social Care and indeed blood cancer charities in attendance. And could we have a look, please, briefly at INQ 497986? Yes, thank you. 12th of July, there's a readout of the meeting that looked like it happened on the 7th of July. Various attendees, including Baroness Brinton. And if we look towards the bottom of the page, Lord Bethell, the Baroness noted she would like to know who is the clinical lead for the work on prophylactic antibodies, who is leading the policy on how to protect the immunocompromised, is there a responsible minister? Do you know the answers to those questions that the Baroness posed?
Yes, and if I may just add, can I just point out that I was up in the House of Lords 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, and peers raised the immunocompromised with me almost every day, and Baroness Brinton in particular was partly because of her own personal expertise and situation, was an advocate. So this wasn't an issue that wasn't flagged to me on an almost daily basis, and therefore I was very live to it. Was there a lead on it? There wasn't a named individual, but it was very much part of the system's priorities, including JVT, who met with them and had done an enormous amount of work on it. And was there a responsible minister? Yes, that was me.
Do you think a clinical lead would have led to a different outcome in terms of how to best protect or try to protect the immunocompromised?
Well, if I may answer that in the round a little bit, if you'll give me a second. I think one of the things I learned from this is that there are, with a big epidemic like this, national responses that address the whole population, and it's reasonable to prioritise those. But there are also a large number of special groups who are going to not be necessarily catered for by the national response. And therefore, you need to have a system that deals with edge cases and special cases. We didn't have that programme. We didn't have a what do we do with the immunocompromised plan at the very beginning. And so we were putting these things together after the fact. Now, partly that's because you don't necessarily know who is going to be, as it were, let down by the national response. So it's difficult. But there are going to be some groups you definitely know might be a problem. And it did strike me that the immunocompromised were one of those groups.
Can I stand back from that for a moment? Because I think you are aware that in August 2021, in a email thread, and can we have it up on screen, please? INQ 40667112_2. The date's been excised, but it's the 20th of August 2021, Lord Bethel. Can you see there in an email from Charlotte Taylor? She's had a brief conversation with the government chief scientific advisor, including the astronaut data or Evusheld data on prophylaxis. I said there is limited enthusiasm for prophylactic use across the system. His reply, I think that's misguided. There's a clear place for them. It just needs to be defined. 2 questions, please. Did you, as your time in minister, sense a limited enthusiasm for prophylactic use?
I think that the response was based on evidence. I don't think that there was a sort of a prejudice. I think, as I've said before, and as the chief scientific advisor pointed out, it's good to challenge assumptions, and maybe there could have been scope for more creativity, which was the point I think I made earlier. So in that respect, I was probably aligned with his thinking. But no, I don't think that there was in any way a sort of built-in prejudice against any particular vector of treatment.
Do I take it from your answer that if there had been that limited enthusiasm, you would agree that it was misguided?
Well, I pushed against it quite hard, as you saw in my note to the Secretary of State. So I was in there challenging and pushing, but decisions were made on the basis of evidence, and non-clinical ministers can only go so far in terms of questioning the evidence.
That's August of 2021, and by September 2021, you left the government. What was the state of play as at the time you left the government in terms of prophylactics and indeed protection of the immunocompromised? So we are coming into about to be the autumn, winter of 2021. What was the state of play at that time?
Well, we were swinging out of lockdowns and intense national programs, and one of the things that we were focusing on was how do you deal with the people who remain vulnerable to the disease, and that included, but not only, the immunocompromised. And that's when the renewed focus was put on all of the other therapies, including the antivirals, to offer those who were shielding, who had led very worried lives for nearly 2 years. How are we going to protect them? And that's really the state of things when I was leaving.
Okay, just a few questions, please, about Evusheld itself, and please say if you're not able or in a position to answer some of them, because they may relate to after your tenure. But from your perspective, did you get a sense of how much, if at all, cost was an issue in the decision not to purchase Evusheld?
Well, across the board, cost did not arise as issues, generally speaking. We were, largely speaking, given everything that we needed in order to fight the virus. And recommendations from the CMO and others were based on clinical evidence, not on economic evidence. That said, cost isn't just a pound, shilling and pence. There's an opportunity cost in terms of how do you prioritise healthcare resources, which were extremely limited. So I wouldn't say that that resources in the broad sense weren't a consideration.
Do you think by not procuring Evusheld, there was a missed opportunity to provide protection and indeed short-term freedoms, perhaps, for the immunocompromised?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I saw the submissions on the pre-purchase agreements earlier in the year, and there they were based on the clinical evidence. The compounds hadn't been through clinical trials yet. The later decisions came after I'd left.
Let me see if you can help with this, and please say if you can't. In light of the decision not to procure Evusheld, how do you consider the needs of the immunosuppressed were properly taken into account after that decision had been made?
I don't know if I can answer after. I would be happy to make comments on the period before.
Fine. And finally, this, please. Obviously, the inquiry's heard evidence that vaccines were purchased on an at-risk basis.
Yes.
Are you able to help why the same was not the position for Evusheld?
Yes. I don't know about if I can say it. Well, yes, and not just Evusheld. Across the board, the therapeutics task force did not have a blank checkbook. It was the big distinction between the vaccine task force and the therapeutics. One of the reasons for that is the therapeutics and antivirals worked in different ways in different circumstances, the five-sided Rubik's Cube that I mentioned earlier. Putting taxpayers' money at risk for that complexity of procurement really wouldn't have made sense. It would have also been a big distraction for the healthcare system, which by implication would have had to twist to meet the delivery demands of each treatment vector, which frankly was beyond the scope of the resources we had.
Different topic, please, Lord Bethell. And just a few questions, please, about the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, or MEAG, as it is sometimes known. Clearly, you set out, and we know that they provide independent advice to the government. The advice is not binding. But you, in your statement, certainly say that it's important to have external ethical advice. You consider it to be important, particularly during the pandemic. Are you aware, certainly, of any advice that specifically addressed the health inequalities faced by ethnic minority groups and how that was integrated into policy decisions or the decisions that you had to make?
Well, our day-to-day conversations about the impact of the vaccine were always included the vulnerable and health inequalities generally. They were a massive priority in everything that we did. I don't think we needed an ethical group to remind us of the importance of that.
In relation to MEAG itself, I think you were, in May of 2020, asked to decide whether to publish MEAG's advice on the government website, and you agreed to that. You were also asked to create what was called a short list of principles on moral and ethical issues for policymakers to consider when developing a new policy. Let's call it a framework for short.
Yeah.
Why did you decide against the creation of such a framework?
Well, I thought that the MEAG was an excellent organisation that worked extremely hard and thoughtfully, in particular when there were requests from ministers on particular issues that had technical ethical considerations. So something like vaccine as a condition of deployment. That has a political implication, an economic implication, a clinical implication, but also a highly technical, ethical implication that would go beyond day-to-day political analysis. So their analysis on something like that was highly valued. But I didn't agree with the Nuffield blog that said that that politicians needed to have hand-holding by ethicists in order to understand the implications of their own decisions. That's what we have in Parliament. I was up every day being challenged on our decisions. So having a broad framework against which our homework would be scored, as it were, seemed to me to be a bit of overreach, and I would draw the line at that kind of generalised ethical advice.
Do you think, and I'm asked to ask you this, whether the publication of a framework could have benefited and indeed protected the vulnerable groups?
No, we were doing that every day.
Finally, this, please, Lord Bethell. I mean, we may have touched on it throughout your evidence, but you make in your statement a number of recommendations, and indeed you've already spoken powerfully about the need for preparedness, something which will resonate with her ladyship's evidence in Module 1, no doubt. But is there a key lesson that you would wish to put before her ladyship?
Yes, well, I think there are probably two, and they are consistent with a lot of what's been said already here before. There should have been a plan for containing the disease and then treating those both who caught the disease and for whom the vaccine didn't work in advance. Instead, we put one together, and I admire the hard work, diligence, and effectiveness of those who were part of that response. But it was notable that we were working from not from a blank sheet in as much as there was previous work, obviously, in this field, but without a clear framework. And secondly, the shape of the healthcare system was not suited for a fast response and delivery. So if you look at the clinical trials or the delivery of antivirals or of biologics or the manufacture and supply chain elements, no thought or consideration had been put into the resilience of the system for when we were going to be hit. And that's really what held us back in this area the most, is the lack of warm resources that were in play on a day-to-day basis, but could be scaled on a national basis when needed.
Can I ask you this then? In your statement, you refer to gaps in the system, perhaps the weaknesses that we alluded to at the beginning of your evidence, certainly falling behind in terms of commercial clinical trials. Do you think now that perhaps rather than learning lessons and being more resilient, we are less resilient than we were when we went into the pandemic?
Frustratingly, I do. I think we're in worse shape today than we were 5 years ago. The NHS is clearly under a huge amount of pressure in terms of capacity. The workforce are under pressure, and there's been a drop-off on recruitment. International surveillance of viruses is not where it could or should be. In terms of the institutions of resilience, UXA, for instance, should be a national agency with heft and resources, and I'm disappointed that it has been denuded in the way it has been. Local resilience forums remain a shadow organisation rather than something with strong local reach. Your Ladyship, I could go on, but there are a dozen of these areas that we should have learnt the lessons on where we simply haven't moved forwards.
Finally, this, please. Would you support the development of a more diverse portfolio of vaccines and indeed antivirals as part of future pandemic preparedness plans?
Yes, as an illustrative point, there is an organisation called REDDI, for the stenographer, that's REDDI, that is trying to put together today genomic data on future viruses in order to have the resources in place to design antivirals for the future. That is an illustration of the kind of preparedness that I think we should be committing to, and would be a strong recommendation that should come from this inquiry.
No doubt one of many. Lord Bethell, thank you very much.
I think there's one more question I've allowed from Mr Wagner. If you can't answer it, please say, Lord Bethell, but I've given Mr Wagner permission to ask one question.
Thank you, and I'm grateful for the permission. Good morning, Lord Bethell. I ask questions on behalf of clinically vulnerable families. I just wanted to ask you a question about something you said earlier, which was you felt that within the NHS we could have been more creative about test and trace and treat, and without care home community and within care home communities, within prophylactically, I don't know whether the transcript's quite right, prophylactically giving people antivirals, having them available for moments of outbreak. Is the implication of what you're saying that the urgent distribution of antivirals during the pandemic to those who needed them was not as effective as it perhaps could have been with more creative thinking?
Well, that should have it is carrying a lot of weight in that sentence. I think that the use of antivirals is fundamentally challenging because of the problem I mentioned, which is you need to get them to people either before they've got the disease or at the very earliest stages, probably before they've got a symptom. And that, not unreasonably, means that they are not put into work very often because of a basic challenge of getting them to work. I think we've reached a moment in history where the technologies around identifying risk and of distributing medicine and of also manufacturing extremely cheaply antivirals means that we should be rethinking that whole mindset. It was difficult to do right in the middle of an epidemic because it requires mechanistically putting together new processes, new arrangements, new ethical agreements, and a whole different pathway for clinicians. These are not insubstantial things to do, but I would highly recommend we look at that agenda so that we're in better shape for next time.
But the systems that were in place that you will have overseen, such as the 5-day window you needed to apply for antivirals in certain circumstances, do you think those systems were effective, or are you suggesting that they weren't particularly effective?
Well, I'm not a clinician, but my impression is that a 5-day window is not a great way of running the antivirus program, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Thank you very much indeed, Lord Bethel. Those are all the questions we have for you. I'm very grateful to you for your insight and for your candour, and also for the fact that you highlighted the important work done on therapeutics and antivirals, and thank you for the pressure you try to maintain while you're in office. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My lady, the next witness is Eddie Gray. Yes, please.
Would you like to repeat after me? I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Hope you're warned you weren't the first witness on, Mr. Gray.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Gray. Could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Yes, my full name is Edward James Gray.
Thank you very much, and thank you for attending today and also for the provision of your witness statement dated the 2nd of October 24. Mr. Gray, you have, I think, some 40 years in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors.
Correct.
You were president of European pharmaceutical business at GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, and I think you were CEO of a company called Dynavax Technologies, and for some time a board member of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. For our purposes, the most relevant part of your career is that you were chair of the Antivirals Task Force from the 1st of June 21 to the 1st of April 2022. Is that right?
That is correct.
And we'll look at the detail, of course, of what you did as the chair of the Antivirals Task Force in a moment. But very broadly, was it the Antivirals Task Force that led on the negotiations for and secured the provision of around 5 million courses of 2 oral antivirals? And they were Paxlovid, Nirmatrelvir, Ritonavir, a Pfizer product known to you as Project Tyne, and also Molnupiravir, known as Project Arrow, a Merck product called, I think, Lagevrio.
Yes, it was.
This is a complex field, Mr. Gray, and I'd like you to start, please, just by highlighting some of the differences between antivirals and more broadly therapeutics and vaccines, because we've had a great deal of evidence about various types of therapeutics and, of course, vaccines, and we need to put it into its proper context. Therapeutics in the form of drugs are not necessarily vaccines. That's right, isn't it? And drugs or medicines or therapeutics may fall into a number of different categories. You might have small molecule drugs, which are known also as, or generally are antivirals, and you may also have something called neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, and we've heard of one in particular, Evusheld. But you are concerned in the antivirals task force with molnupiravir and nirmatrelvir, which are not neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, are they?
They are not.
And unlike vaccines, drugs may be given prophylactically as well as by way of treatment for a disease. And in the case of antivirals, and you were concerned with oral antivirals, is that something that can be given prophylactically as well as by way of treatment? Or is it something that, in general terms, needs to be given as you're under attack from the virus and therefore needing the beneficial impact of the antiviral? It
Right.
does what it says on the tin.
Yes. So I think you referenced differences between the antiviral task force task and that of the vaccines. And I think clarity around the utility of the different medicines was one of the key differences. Because I think for vaccines, a very early position was adopted that if you could find effective vaccines, as a population intervention, they were likely to be the most effective response to the pandemic. But there was no real question about their utility. If Kate and her team could identify and find these vaccines, then we were all going to get lined up and jabbed with them. So that was fairly straightforward. But with antivirals, there are different ways in which they can be employed.
So do you mean by way of oral ingestion or injection? They were oral medicines, and we were seeking oral medicines because that was the easiest way to deliver them when we had them. But you can utilize them in a broad population basis, possibly prophylactically, where the goal that you're trying to achieve there is really to interrupt transmission, to reduce the level of impact upon individual patients of having contracted the virus, and to clear them of the virus and to stop them passing it on to other people. Alternatively, you can not give it to a widespread population, but you can hold it back and recognize that there are certain people in the population who are more badly affected by the virus. And in this instance, the focus was really on people who might go on to be hospitalized or indeed to death as a consequence. And in that instance, you're really looking for a very high value response in reducing hospitalization and death, but you're restricting its use, and it's really then only about treatment. There is no prophylaxis involved in that particular case. So at some stage in the process, a clear strategic decision needs to be taken as to whether or not you're aiming to try to protect the country at a population level, or whether you're trying to focus on, and
Yes.
you have only the means to focus on, sectorial groups,
Yes.
those special cases who are particularly vulnerable.
Yes, and I think it's reflected by when I arrived as the chair of the task force, I basically arrived with three questions. Why are we buying these medicines? What are we trying to achieve with them? And do we know how to get the best out of them? And driving through responses to those questions really gets you then to the choices that you make.
You became the chair on the 1st of June 2021. There had already been in existence for almost a year the Therapeutics Task Force, which was constituted, I think, in April 2020.
Yep.
Why was an antivirals task force needed, in your view? Why could not the issue of oral antivirals be addressed by the Therapeutics Task Force, oral antivirals being, of course, a therapeutic?
Well, as I understand the decision-making process, and it was only communicated to me, I think there was a view felt that with the winter approaching, and that was going to be the most fertile period for use of effective antivirals, that much like the decision around the vaccine task force, there was benefit to separating it out and having focus upon it, and therefore it was removed from the therapeutics and set up as a separate task force.
And were you aware of a clear political imperative or drive or direction that you try to identify and then procure and make available two antivirals in particular? No, not two particular types, but you were tasked to try to identify two oral antivirals.
Yes, and actually that made a great deal of sense. And actually, to the point you just made there, actually, you do want them to be two slightly different modes of action, because if you have two different modes of actions in antivirals within the same patient population, that's a long story as to why, but it's beneficial in heading off the potential for resistance if you have different modes of action operating in the population at the same time. So we did want to, and we were hopeful that we would get two different modes of action.
And you were hopeful that you would get them there by the winter of that year?
That was the key issue, yes.
And was that because of the prospect of a further wave of COVID or because it was winter?
Well, the waves of COVID were coming to their own pattern, I guess is probably the best way of doing it. But generally speaking, yes, in a winter environment, respiratory infections are generally more prevalent and more likely to cause widespread problems. So we did expect winter to be more of an issue, yeah.
And antivirals themselves need to be speedily given. That is, they need to be given at a relatively early stage in the disease path, bluntly.
In
you need to be given
them
as quickly as you can get them into people who are beginning to show signs of suffering from
Generally in respiratory infections, there's a benefit to getting them in early, yes.
You were approached, I think, first in March 2021 to become the chair of the Antivirals Task Force, but you weren't appointed until the 1st of June.
Yes.
In the context of trying to identify and make available two oral antivirals by that same winter, that seems to be quite a significant elapse of time.
Well, I think for my written statement, I went through the process of calculating. It was 25% of the available of the available time, which I have to say I felt a strange use of the time. It wasn't clear to me why that was the case. I think I speculate in my witness statement around why the possible reasons for that, although you kindly sent me some other witness statements as part of preparation for this, and I did note in there, I think it was Patrick Valence's statement that the permanent secretary at the time was advocating not to have an external chair, so I presume that was part of the background to the delay.
We needn't perhaps look at the reasons why the process did become so protracted, but it must have been obvious to you that by comparison perhaps to Dame Kate Bingham, whose appointment as the external chair of the Vaccine Task Force went through within a matter of weeks, and also perhaps by comparison to Charlotte Taylor of the DHSC, who chaired the Therapeutics Task Force, the process of getting you in place seemed to have been much more protracted.
Yes, it was, and I think we're talking a year on. And I think, obviously, when you look at Kate's evidence and Kate's experience, the concern about the pandemic at that point in time led to a lot of very different decisions, and the setup of the vaccine task force in Bays with a direct reporting line to the Prime Minister. I think by the time antivirals were set up, a year later, the world had moved on, and I think we were rather more, what's the right way to phrase it? There was a greater sense of a return to normal business, and this had a task force plonked on top of it, and that's the situation we found ourselves in.
Were you able to form an understanding as to the degree of autonomy that you would be permitted? The Antivirals Task Force was within the DHSC, was it not?
Yes.
So not Bays like the Vaccine Task Force, and not an entirely external body. Do you happen to know whether or not the DHSC, for example, welcomed the existence of the Antivirals Task Force within the DHSC, and whether or not perhaps it opposed having a more external and independent body?
Well, as I say, I've learnt from the other submissions that you've provided to me that the Permanent Secretary at the time was apparently arguing against Patrick's support of an external chair. The fact that I was appointed presumably means that others thought that it was important to have the external chair. And I think, perhaps on this subject, I've taken a point of having a look through various submissions at lessons and watching some of the other people giving evidence to you in this particular module. And it has struck me that there's been much acknowledgement of the need for different decision-making, for embedding of certain skills, etc. Nowhere in the lessons learned is there a comment around the contribution or value of an external chair in these things that I could find. There may be one there, but if there is, I couldn't find it.
And actually, my lady asked a question directly of an earlier witness as to the undoubted benefits of external experience.
Yeah.
And of course, we're well aware of the differences between the private and the public sectors in terms of running such bodies. Let's have a look, please, at your letter of appointment. Well, was it from Mr. Hancock? Were you appointed by Mr. Hancock?
I was.
INQ 000410503. If we look at that page, and the letter is dated the 27th of May 2021, so 4 or 5 days before your formal appointment, we can see that at the bottom of the page, he refers to the great success of the vaccination programme. But he is alert to, and of course this was a very obvious concern, that there would be certain groups in relation to whom presentation for vaccine was lower, and also significant groups who could not take the vaccine or for whom the vaccines would have comparatively a lesser degree of benefit. So the government was hoping to achieve the same success as the Vaccine Task Force. And over the page, we can see the objectives which were identified for your task force: to have 2 effective antiviral treatments deployable by the winter, identify the most promising treatments, work with developers, license holders, help manufacturers to scale up, drive commercial discussions, and create a pipeline, and this is obviously a nod to the future, of additional promising novel antivirals. Were those core objectives the right ones, as you saw it, Mr. Gray?
Yes.
And in terms of reporting, was there a proper system in place for your reporting structures?
Well, as you can see here, I was reporting to Lord Bethell, but there was an expectation that I would work independently and show leadership of the task force personnel. I'd gone through quite a protracted process in ensuring that I had clearance to what was called direct people on the team and officials, and that was something I insisted on, having consulted people like Kate and others who'd worked in these environments before, because I did feel that that was important. You couldn't be sidelined just as an advisor whose input could be followed or not followed, depending on which way the wind was blowing. And so I think it was very clear at this point that we were not going to get an organisation, a little structure and a reporting line similar to the vaccine question. But I did feel this was a very important job that needed doing, and therefore felt I should say yes to doing it, but secured that as a mechanism for ensuring that I could have an impact. And of course, there was nothing, as we will no doubt come on to discuss later, stopping me writing to whoever I chose to write to.
And you wrote, I think, prolifically, didn't
yes,
you?
Yes,
to the Prime Minister repeatedly and
Yes, yeah.
to the Secretary of State on a
Exactly.
almost weekly basis.
Exactly.
It is notable that when Dame Kate Bingham agreed to become the chair of the Vaccine Task Force, she demanded and got the condition, or at least the agreement of government that she would have a clear mandate with a direct reporting line to the Prime Minister, also that the vaccine task force would be located within BEIS, not by implication the DHSC, and also that she would have the ability to establish a dedicated budget across government. You were not given, perhaps you didn't see them, but you weren't given that degree of largesse, were you?
No. But as I say, I think the world had moved on. It was clear that there had been conversations behind the scenes, both about the BEIS decision, and I think you've been investigating them here. And, you know, one person's fruitful discussion between colleagues is another person's turf war. I have no idea where on that spectrum all of this sat. But I did feel that the issue of getting these two across the line for winter was the most critical issue. And at some point, you just have to get started.
And to that end, you had a number of structures within the task force. You had a steering committee, you had a programme board, and within your organisation, you had a number of subgroups, did you not, that dealt with specific topics such as trial implementation and deployment, planning, procurement, supply, manufacture, policy, and so on.
That is correct.
In general terms, what did you understand to be the position in terms of your budget when you took on the task of becoming the chair?
So about 2 or 3 weeks in, we indicated that a budget had been set for the purchase of antivirals. It became clear that that was calculated by going back to a prior pandemic in the sort of 2008. And there had been antivirals employed there which were already available, were there for flu, and the price was set, and etc. And so a calculation had been simply say, multiply that up by however many we think we might need this time, and that was the budget. But of course, in this instance, the medicines were developed in a very different way. The companies involved, to their credit, took on the most difficult challenge by setting their phase 3 trial endpoints to be the reduction in hospitalisation and death. And as a consequence of that, they could see and expected to be recompensed for a much higher value product. Consequence of that then meant that actually the original calculations were sort of comparing apples to oranges, and I think it was always likely from that point on that the budget that had been set was going to be challenging to meet.
I.e., you would need a lot more money than provisionally had been set aside.
Correct.
The vaccine task force proceeded on the basis that it would be able to enter negotiations with manufacturers and ultimately procure vaccines at risk. That is to say, they would be able to enter into commercial arrangements, even quite a long way down that path, so not just by way of entering into heads of agreement, but agreeing contracts. At risk, that is to say, without knowing whether or not the particular vaccine would work, let alone be authorised. Was that the same approach that was applied to the purchase of the potential 2 oral antivirals?
Yes, and of course we also took every opportunity to mitigate that risk. So every contract that we signed was subject to completion of the clinical trials and approval of the medicines by the MHRA.
So you were given that same strategic opportunity as the vaccine task force had been given?
We were.
Was there, in relation to the budgeting and approval of the financing for individual oral antivirals, any form of ministerial panel, of which we've heard much in the context of the vaccine task force, a body bringing together ministers from the Treasury as well as DHSC and perhaps other governmental spending departments to authorise payments above a certain amount?
There was, I believe, a sort of mechanism for approval of financial decisions, which was primarily set up within the therapeutics task force. And I think the idea was that as antivirals, we would use that same mechanism. But I think the speed at which we were moving and the questions we were answering and the fact that we were buttressing up against what I think was a poorly calculated initial budget meant that we moved to different mechanisms of trying to get decisions made.
And very soon after you became the chair, did you have to address the issue of whether or not, in reality, that level of funding would be available?
Yes. So if you recall what I said about the different ways that you can use these, if you look at the initial brief to the task force, basically every single possible way of using them was in the brief. And the consequence, of course, when you then calculate against that brief, you come up with an immense number, literally billions, of how much that would cost. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody at the time said, well, look, we have to acknowledge that the task force have very comprehensively answered the exam question that was set. We just don't like the answer. And I had sympathy with that. It was the original brief hadn't been thought through properly. But the fact that that number came up and got everybody's attention, I think was very useful, because it stimulated then a much more sensible conversation around how should we use these? What is the appropriate way to use them? We had more information now on vaccines and their rollout and what we were starting to see. And whilst you could never take away the idea that a true vaccine escape would put greater pressure back on antiviral use, you could then start to have a sensible conversation which resulted in a recommendation that we should purchase antivirals to cover those people who were immune compromised and would struggle with getting a good vaccine response. And that's what we then started to focus all our activity on.
Of course, by June 2021, the United Kingdom had gone through the entirety of the phase 1 of the JCVI's priority list.
Yep.
99% of those most vulnerable to morbidity or mortality had been offered vaccination. And it was becoming clear that the vaccine program, to a very large extent, was going to succeed.
Correct.
Do you think that against that political backdrop, there was less willingness on the part of government to give you the funding that you felt you needed, or to give you the degree of largesse, my word, that the vaccine task force was itself permitted?
I think I should probably say that I've never taken a business decision I can recall where some element of affordability, or in small companies, even whether you've got the cash available, is not part of the equation. So the idea that somebody somewhere was trying to sort of balance out the public health position that we were advocating with the country's ability to afford it, in principle, I had no objection to. The issue for me was really, was the process in place and the appropriate people in place to make that trade-off? And I didn't believe that was what was happening. And that's what led me to try and step out of the system to sort of do that. But yes, I think in 2021, the world had undoubtedly moved on. There was a great deal more commentary in the public environment about how the pandemic was being managed, what was deemed to be going well and not going well. And there was a very open debate at this point in time about the economic impacts of the pandemic, which I think it's fair to say back in 2020 you didn't see in the public commentary at all. So we were caught up in that, undoubtedly. Yeah.
I should have asked you, I neglected to do so. In terms of the devolved administration, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, did the remit of the antivirals task force extend across the United Kingdom? So whatever oral antivirals you were able to identify, procure and make available, were you doing so for the whole of the United Kingdom?
We were, and there were meetings with the devolved administrations where the plans were presented to them, and they all agreed that they would prefer to be with the task force's work rather than reproduce it for themselves.
That they were happy for you to lead the charge.
Correct.
And to take whatever benefit you were able to come
Correct.
With. Let's look then at the chronology of how you reached the position whereby you were able to make you were able to procure 5 million of those courses. In your statement, you very helpfully set out a chronology of the events, and we're just going to look at a few of the paragraphs. INQ 000474342, page 9, paragraph 27.4, you refer to the fact that on the 18th of June, you were informed that the Treasury had approved a funding envelope for the Antivirals Task Force of £621.5 million for the financial year 21-22. Obviously, you were in June of 2021, so you were looking for approval for expenditure throughout the rest of that financial year. Going forward from April 22 would be another matter. You weren't, in fact, the chair after April 22, were you?
No, but obviously we were looking, as we may get on to talk to, we came to the conclusion that attempting to purchase to cover the first 2 winters was the appropriate strategic picture to take, given a whole host of factors, not the least of which was likely availability of supply, and so that would have incurred additional costs later in the system after I had in fact left. Yeah.
Now, I don't want you to give me the exact amount, because some might be able to work out from the overall amount that you sought the unit cost of the individual courses.
Yes.
For the 2 drugs. But in general terms, although the Treasury had approved a funding envelope for £621.5 million, had a figure in the billions been initially suggested and perhaps put around government departments to the effect that that was the sort of funding which might be required if you were going to try and provide therapeutic remedy to a much larger part of the population?
So I think I did hear somebody earlier in their evidence talk about 2 phases. I'd actually describe it as 3 phases. So the first phase was answering the original exam question, which was many, many billions, and was clearly not appropriate in the circumstances. The second phase was when we started to advocate what we felt was necessary to cover the immunocompromised. And we were doing so now having found out that this was the budget set. The number we recommended was not of the original magnitude, but was greater than the 621 had we procured the full amount that we recommended. But as I think you see in the documentation, we secured less than was originally,
We'll come to that.
but was consistent with this number.
Just on that first point, though, the first phase, the importance of this point is, though, that there are some who say the government should have made billions of pounds available, but you, as the professional, the external head of the Antivirals Task Force, appreciated and proceeded on the basis that you had to be much more realistic in terms of what level of funding would be available from the Treasury.
Yes, and I think that was based on this continuing accumulation of evidence about the progress of the pandemic, and in particular, the success that the vaccine
Programme
was having. There was always one big unknown that you simply couldn't control for, and that was an escape variant. And that was a completely different environment, obviously, and the scale of what response you would have to generate on antivirals was out there. But I think the emerging view of the CMO and others was that was a manageable risk.
By escape variant, you mean the possibility of a variant of coronavirus SARS-2 coming into play, meaning that the existing vaccines would no longer be as effective.
Correct.
Would no longer be as effective. All right. Then in August, the middle of August, on the 18th, INQ 0000064095, you wrote to the Prime Minister to say that you'd identified 3 antiviral candidates. 2 of them were molnupiravir and nirmatrelvir, ritonavir, the Paxlovid, Pfizer oral antiviral, and those 2 were the 2 that you went on to procure. There was a third one that didn't go anywhere. On page 2, having identified the two novel antiviral treatments, you deal with the process of supporting priority antiviral candidates to progress rapidly in clinical trials. Presumably, whatever oral antiviral you had identified would have to go through clinical trials in order to be able to secure authorization from the MHRA.
Correct.
And was there a system already in place for the carrying out of those clinical trials?
So the clinical trials for antiviral candidates were the responsibility of the companies that were developing them. And by the time I became the chair, those trials were well advanced. Clearly, this is very much a normal operational practice for these organisations. I think I'm right in saying at the time I started that 2 of the 3 candidates were already in phase 3, and the third one was in phase 2. And so they were progressing, and we did talk to both organisations about the ability of having trial sites in the UK, and I think one of the companies, if my recollection is correct, did recruit some UK patients, but we were not in any way getting formally involved in the trial. That was their responsibility, and I think one company had UK patients and the other didn't, if memory serves me correctly.
So you didn't have to deal with the difficulties that other, particularly phase 2 clinical trials,
We did not.
for therapeutics had to encounter, which was difficulties of recruitment and whether the trials were sufficiently diverse or underpowered or managed.
We did
You
not.
had a clear line of sight.
We did. And the issues of things like diversity, of course, these large pharmaceutical companies are doing these trials in different areas all the time. Those goals of diversity, etc., are part of their normal standard operating procedures. So I was confident that we were going to get properly managed, high-quality studies, and that the MHRA would be able to make their decision.
All right. Then, at the end of August, you wrote to the Secretary of State 000489913, I think on the 30th of August, to give advice as to what he should do. And by this stage, August 2021, the Secretary of State would have been Sir Sajid Javid.
Yes.
Mr. Hancock having resigned, and you submitted options for purchase of antivirals over the next 2 years. And how many courses did you, in terms of millions, did you recommend be purchased?
So 25 million.
And was that over that year to the
No,
winter
that was
21
over
or over 2 years?
That was over the 2 years.
All right. And in the middle of the page, we can see, I believe, reference to the amount of the funding which had been available. And if it's not on this page, it'll be on the next. Yes, the top of the page, thank you. The top line highlight that the ATF budget of 623 million is insufficient to allow procurement of any reasonable volume, given market dynamics and the international context of constrained global supply until at least 2024. So, in essence, were you saying the budget's not going to be enough to get the number of courses that we would recommend that we pursue, you're going to have to increase it?
That is what I was saying, yes.
Further down the page, at paragraph 8, if we scroll out, we'll see that you say this: I do feel it's important that decisions are not reverse engineered from a financial target. What did you mean by that?
What I felt it was important was that we were, in negotiating the balance between the public health goal and the affordability, that we started from the process of public health and ensuring that we reached absolutely what we felt was at the very least the minimum that would achieve our goal, rather than starting from 623 working out what you could get for that.
All right. And was that why, if we look at page 3, paragraph 14, you provided, thank you very much, you provided a number of options, but you identified that as an absolute minimum, you had to get 1.8 million courses from Arrow, Arrow being Merck, that's the molnupiravir
Yes.
oral antiviral, isn't it? And the full 250,000 from Tyne, so that's the Paxlovid, the Pfizer, from this autumn and winter, giving us a total of 2.05 million doses, and then you wanted another 700,000 courses of molnupiravir.
That was our advice, yes.
Around this time, the inquiry has seen evidence in the form of emails from you to Sir John Bell and the then government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, saying, in essence, about the Secretary of State, Sir Sajid Javid, he's supported our recommendations, which is good, but getting decisions across him, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, has been ridiculously hard. Why were you saying that in email correspondence, whilst at the same time you had given the government or the Treasury options as to how they should proceed in terms of funding?
Oh, well, the memo that you've just shown was consistent, I think, with the frustration I was starting to feel at this point in time about the decision-making process. And the only way in which I was concerned that the process of constant reiteration meant that this potential trade-off between public health goals and affordability goals ended up being the decision being made by junior civil servants, because in the system that operates, there appears to be a premium for the civil service to agree an answer to a question, feed that answer up on both sides of the House, and then so the same recommendation goes to ministers in two separate parts. And I didn't, in this instance, feel that that was appropriate. I thought, if we're making a trade-off of this nature, I fully understand that it may have to be made, but the senior responsible people should be making that decision. And consequently, rather than allow that to sort of continue, I simply wrote to the Secretary of State saying, here's my advice. Now, separately, we were starting to stimulate the process around thinking about the next phase and future medicines. And John Bell was involved in helping us set that up and introduce us to people who could contribute. But as you said, John was involved in many other things Sir John was involved in many other things. And he'd picked up from somewhere that, the conversation over this particular decision was sort of getting a bit mired and going a bit slow and not necessarily going very well. So I think I'm right in saying, if you follow that email trail back, it started with John's letter, not mine, John's email, not mine, and I was responding to that and sharing my frustration that he'd already identified.
So in essence, Mr. Gray, what you're saying is that you would have preferred your departmental officials, the people within DHSC, the people who are assisting you within government and assisting the antivirals task force, to be more proactive in terms of putting their fiscal case to the Treasury,
yes,
and then seeing where the cards fell.
Yes.
As opposed to, within the bureaucracy of government, trying to find the lowest common denominator. Yes. That is to say, a fiscal package that would itself be acceptable to the Treasury. Is that what you're saying?
I am. I think there's a part of the concern I had with the process I was observing was a clear power imbalance. And I could see officials in the Department of Health and Social Care essentially starting to undermine their own argument for the recommendation we were making before we'd ever had the proper discussion at the right level. And as I've said, my conclusion was the only way to sort of spike that was to step out of the system and go directly to those people who I felt should be making the decision.
So, in fact, you emailed the Secretary of State on the 8th of September, and then not content with that, or perhaps the reaction in the meantime, you emailed the Prime Minister directly on the 15th of September. If we just look, please, at the email to the Prime Minister of the 15th of September, INQ 000410527, in essence, you, if I can summarise your email in this way, you set out what the aims of your antivirals task force were, and in particular the procurement of the 2 oral antivirals for that winter. And of course, by now we're talking September. And you say at the bottom of the page, you recognise that you're in competition with other countries for a limited supply of medicines. So in essence, you need to get on and buy them. And on page 3, you set out again the options. Order immediately from Arrow 2.5 million courses, intermediate, order some lower than 2.5 million courses from Arrow, Arrow being Merck. Not affordable option, order no further courses or only those courses affordable under the current budget or only sufficient courses to support the National Institute of Healthcare Research trial. In the event, on the 26th of September, so about 10 days later, you were informed, were you not, that what had been agreed at that presumably very high level was that you may proceed to buy or negotiate over the purchase of 480,000 Molnupiravir courses, that's to say the Project Arrow. That was way short of what you were looking for, was it not?
Yep.
And did there come a time where you had to go back into bat, you had to try to get the numbers up, and you pursued the DHSC and HMT to agree a larger number of courses?
Just before you go on, Mr. Keith, I remember once when I was having to negotiate with ministers that I was told that only certain people necessarily have their letters or emails forwarded directly to the Minister or the Secretary of State.
Right.
Were you confident that your emails and letters were going to either Mr. Hancock or the Prime Minister?
Yes, because generally speaking, I asked for a reply.
And I think, Mr.
And so I did. So I knew if I didn't get one of those, yes. Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say, Mr. Green, that when you emailed the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister, you made sure that you'd emailed all their private secretaries, permanent secretaries, under-secretaries. There wasn't any way that it wasn't going to get to their attention in the end.
No, and I think it goes back a little to the point you were making right about the very beginning about the different setups. I think, my view was that I always had the option, if that's the right phrase, of throwing my toys out the pram if necessary, and this felt like an appropriate time to do so.
The number of courses agreed with the Prime Minister, you presume it was the Prime Minister, but somebody at a higher level, was less than you had thought. But you had got then agreement in principle to that purchase. However, in the middle of October, on the 21st, the evidence before the inquiry suggests that HMT, the Treasury, requested of you, your task force, what was called a deployment plan. That is to say, evidence of why you needed the courses of Molnupiravir, how they were going to be deployed if you got them, and what benefit, I suppose, would be derived thereby. Agreement having been made to that purchase, although it was a purchase you wouldn't have agreed to yourself, it was less than you wanted, why was the Treasury asking for further information in support of your request for authority to purchase?
So I think I read it slightly differently. So first of all, I think the fact that we had an operational plan to get the best from what we'd been able to secure, I had, in principle, no issue with. Absolutely, particularly if you have been restricted in how much you want. I think one of the big benefits of the panoramic trial that we eventually went on to utilise was that it absolutely guaranteed that the courses that we'd bought would in fact go to the people who really needed them, rather than to sort of just dissipate throughout the system. I think the Treasury saw it as the responsibility to ensure that, having spent the money, that we were getting cost-effective use out of it, and it was a natural fallout of a plan we were putting together anyway, so it didn't strike me as a particular hindrance or burden.
All right.
Yeah.
In the event, negotiations with government, or at least communications with government as to the procurement of a larger number of courses of stocks proceeded, and Sir Sajid Javid, I think, authorised more stocks to be bought, more courses to be bought by the end of November. There was an email that we asked Sir Sajid to comment on. It's not on the screen, it won't be in the system. But it was an email dated the 1st of December 2021, in which you referred to a dreadful sense of déjà vu and being mired in the treacle of interdepartmental process and argument. Yes. Lovely prose, but by the 1st of December, Mr. Gray, Sir Sajid had authorised the purchase of, or the pursuit of the procurement of, the greater number of stocks that you'd looked for.
Yes. So I think there were two sources of frustration for me in this whole process. One was bypassing normal practice to get the right people to make the decision. But even when you did that, the timeliness of that decision was then a separate problem. And so Sajid, or the Secretary of State, had requested us to go out and secure more supply. We had negotiated with the companies concerned. Clearly, we were not the only country coming back to them at this point in time, because this whole initiative was now on the back of the emergence of Omicron, and of course all other countries had the emergence of Omicron at the same time. So having responded swiftly and effectively to the request, we were then in the same situation of how do we get the final approval for the spend, and that turned out to be as slow as previous occasions, which was equally frustrating as previous occasions.
All right. In November and December, authorisation was granted for the 2 oral antivirals by the MHRA, we know from other evidence, and you reached agreement with the manufacturers for those further courses to be bought. And then were the 2 oral antivirals put through what was called the panoramic clinical trial process, in order to ensure that, of course, in terms of effectiveness and safety, they were appropriate for use?
Yes, I think there were 2 reasons why I supported Panoramic. One of them I've already mentioned, which was to simply put the stock we had out into the national health system, ran the risk of people who were not in the most vulnerable groups getting courses, and then we get to a point in the process where people on the vulnerable list needed the courses and we'd run out. So this was a means of managing the process by which the people who we'd bought them for were the people who got them. I think the second value of Panoramic was a reflection now that we were in a world where everybody had been vaccinated, and whilst the outcome of Panoramic wasn't necessarily going to determine any of our actions in that first winter, a much better understanding of the impact of these antivirals in a vaccinated setting was going to be useful going forward in the future. So I thought they were the 2 primary reasons that led me to support Panoramic as a good idea.
Once the oral antivirals had been authorised and they'd been trialled, they're 2 separate processes, of course,
Yep.
and therefore proved to be effective and safe, they were allowed to be made available.
Correct.
To those groups for whom vaccines, for a variety of reasons, may not work.
Correct.
We know from the evidence before the inquiry that the route by which, in general terms, the antivirals were made available was through a body called the COVID Medicines Delivery Unit. Was that something of which you had oversight? Was that a process with which you were involved at all, or was that down the road, further down the course of making antivirals available and for other parts of government?
So that was within the National Health Service. And my recollection, which I'm happy to be contradicted if my recollection's not right, but the setting up of Panoramic primarily involved people's presentations at general practice, identification and confirmation of infection, and then they were given the antiviral medicine. Two things came up. The CMO, if my recollection is correct, identified that within that within that population, there was an even more vulnerable group, the most vulnerable group of all, a smaller group, for whom putting them in a trial setting was not appropriate. So they had to have the antiviral.
They had to be offered it out with the treatment.
Any outwith of the treatment thing. And there was also, I seem to remember, some question mark as well about very rural areas being able to get the antivirals to them. So CDMUs, my recollection was, were set up to sort of help address those two questions. But as I say, I would accept if my recollection of that is not wholly accurate. So no, I wasn't responsible for it, but I was involved in meetings and discussions about the need for them. Yeah.
Within your functions, Mr. Gray, lay an obligation to consider future pandemic preparedness. And in the autumn of 2021, did you task a team within your task force to look at future pandemic preparedness? And were a number of papers?
We did, although the paper did not, wasn't finalised until after I'd left, but I did kick it off, yes.
We've seen a paper, it's undated, but it talks about a meeting called the EDI-FPP, Future Pandemic Preparedness Group, regarding future pandemic preparedness. And it talks about the need, of course, for onshore manufacturing, it needs for the need for speed, for adhering to what we've heard was the 100-day mission, which was the United Kingdom G7 promoted policy. You wrote a number of letters to the Secretary of State on the 10th of January 22, and then later in January 22, about manufacturing and future pandemic preparedness. Why did you feel there was a need to write directly to the Secretary of State on these issues?
My recollection at the time was that that was in response to a request to do so.
In your emails, we needn't put them up, you deal with the issues of onshore manufacturing. You call or you observe that there's a great need to develop appropriate infrastructure. You need different options for manufacturing, alternatives to manufacturing, and of course having as wide a range of therapeutics, or particularly oral antivirals, as possible. That process culminated in a letter you sent to the Secretary of State on the 28th of March 22, which must have been a week or so before you stood down. And you talk in that letter of questions needing to be addressed and challenges needed to be overcome. And you talk in terms of the interface, to use a neutral word, between civil service and external professional experience, and how your job in terms of getting these two oral antivirals out of the door was made a great deal harder by that working relationship, or the lack of working relationship. Why, again, did you think it necessary to write to the Secretary of State about this aspect of the administrative structures inside government?
Well, this was essentially my goodbye letter. And I think I knew that the decision post my leaving wasn't to have antivirals remain as a separate task force. It was going to be folded back in to the therapeutic task force. And I also knew with my own departure that all the other external people were leaving as well. I just felt it would be important for the Secretary of State to have, as a resource, essentially my summation of where we were and the things that I thought he would need to have at the front of his mind as the pandemic continued to play out. So it was simply meant as a sort of helpful, here's my leaving, here's a mind dump of the things I think I've learned. Hopefully it's of use to you. Yeah.
In 2020, there was no vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Did you therefore ask in your letter the Secretary of State to consider what might have happened, what might have been possible if, in the course of 2020, there had been available oral antivirals or perhaps neutralizing monoclonal antibodies in the absence of a vaccine? What would have been the likely impact in terms of hospitalization and death in the United Kingdom?
Yes. I felt thinking about 2020 was just a useful analytical construct for thinking about a future pandemic. Because even with 100-day missions and other good plans in place, I think one of the things we have to recognise in this pandemic was we were very fortunate that we got a vaccine quickly that worked. And as I believe you've had in evidence from other people, we cannot guarantee that that will happen next time. So the idea of looking at this current pandemic and saying, how do we avoid 2020 next time, just seemed to me a useful way to think about it. And to sort of then, in thinking about preparation for another one, don't have the concentration of that thinking upon getting to a vaccine as the only thing you're thinking about, because there may well be things that you can do in the run-up to that which mitigate some of the impacts that we experienced in 2020 this time around. So that was my thought process.
And that's an appeal which you presumably reiterate to this tribunal?
Absolutely, yes.
Your statement doesn't pull its punches, Mr. Gray, in terms of your reflections on working in government. And I'm just going to summarise them, if I may. You, like, in fact, Dame Kate Bingham before you, note the lack of what you describe are necessary skills and experience to make informed decisions in this technical, business, scientific arena. And you say that the civil service suffered from a lack of relevant experience. There were too many generalists, not enough, I think you would say, STEM graduates. Too many committees, too much paperwork, writing endless submissions and emails, and therefore a process which was burdened by its administrative weight.
Yes.
And leading to decisions which seemed to you being made that were safer and therefore wrong than a decision that was perhaps just riskier and braver and more likely to get us to where we needed to be. Is that a fair summary?
Sadly, yes, it is.
You mentioned earlier how you'd started in November of 21 formulating some policy proposals for the future, in particular in relation to future pandemic preparedness. And were three of them, in fact, recommendations which my lady has heard much about. Firstly, to develop a research and development infrastructure that supports the exploration of a broad spectrum of oral antivirals or therapeutics. Secondly, build a library of prototype antivirals that can then be put properly but safely but rapidly through phase 2-3 clinical trials, and also increase investment in diagnostic development work.
Yes.
Are those the three, in your assessment, the three most important recommendations that you put in your statement, and which, in fact, appear in the report that was finalised after you left?
Yes, I would still be in support of all of those three.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keith. Mr. Gray, thank you so much for the help you've given the inquiry. I think your evidence has highlighted the need to have external chairs, if I may say so. Not that I needed any persuading. It must have been very frustrating for you at times. And may I say, on behalf of the population of the United Kingdom, we were extremely fortunate that people like you and Kate Bingham were prepared to bring your skills and expertise to chair the task forces, and I'd like to offer you our thanks.
Well, firstly, thank you. I did put in my final letter to the Secretary of State that I think it was. I know everybody outside of government who contributed felt very positive about the opportunity to do so. And I should actually say, despite my criticisms of the civil service, that the team that we formed, combining external and civil service people in the task force, I think did an outstanding job, including a very smart and impressive cohort of young civil servants. And I remain very proud of what they achieved, and I should thank them.
My lady, would you allow me simply also to observe through Mr. Gray that the head of your programme board was, I think, Charlotte Taylor.
She was.
And she was also the official who was in charge of the therapeutics task force.
Correct.
She obviously did an amazing job. My lady, for a variety of reasons, it hasn't been possible to call her to give evidence before you, but she is possibly the last person in the trilogy of chairs to whom great tribute must be paid.
And thank you for what you said too about the officials with whom you worked closely, obviously, Mr. Gray. I'm not suggesting the entire civil service is full of people who impose bureaucracy, but I think one of the messages that I'm getting from you and from Dame Kate is that processes may be important in peacetime, but when it comes to an emergency, you need to be able to push aside some of the...
I would 100% agree with that, yes.
Thank you very much. I shall return at 1:55.